What are mental dysfunctions and who gets to decide them? That's the key theme of this conversation. Justin Garson is professor of philosophy at Hunter College and at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. His work focuses on the philosophy of madness, evolution of the mind, purposes and functions in nature, and psychiatry. His latest book, Madness, a Philosophical Exploration, is a brilliant deep dive into this topic where he explicates the view of looking at some forms of mental dysfunctions as strategy rather than dysfunction, how they're usually viewed. Here we talk about mental dysfunctions, madness, psychiatry, and how to think about functions and purposes in nature and in an evolutionary context. Here is my conversation with Justin Garson. Okay, so I think the best place to start would be what we talked about over email yesterday, sort of the story of how you first became interested in psychiatry and then that led you to being curious about functions and then back to psychiatry.
So, when I was in graduate school, I was actually quite interested in philosophy of psychiatry and this whole question of what are mental disorders and how do we distinguish disorders from non-disorders. So, when they put together this guidebook like the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, how did they decide what goes in? How did they decide what goes out? And in a sense, more importantly, who gets to decide? Like, who gets to decide what things count as mental illness and what things count as just ordinary, but perhaps unusual, ways of thinking or ways of feeling. And, I've kind of my own family, mental health history. I was always obsessed with these kinds of questions. My dad was diagnosed with a serious mental disorder. I was diagnosed with a mental disorder at 16 with depression. And so these were always very real, very kind of urgent questions to me. And whenever I talk to, well, both philosophers, but also sometimes psychiatrists, I'm like, how do you decide what's normal, what's not normal, what's a disorder, what's not a disorder? The answer was usually something like this. In order for something to be a mental disorder, it has to stem from a dysfunction inside of you. There has to be something objectively going on in your brain or in your mind that's not working the way that it's supposed to. So in the same way that, when somebody has diabetes, it's because something inside of them is not objectively working the way it's supposed to. They said, psychiatry is the same way. And more, we're finding evidence of which parts of the brain exactly aren't working the way that they're supposed to in the case of, say, schizophrenia or depression. But of course, as philosophers, that just raises this whole new set of questions. Well, what is functioning and what is dysfunctioning? What does it mean to function well? What does it mean to function poorly? And then the exact same question, like who gets to decide what counts as proper functioning of the brain? So you're really just pushing this question of authority back one level from, okay, who gets to decide what counts as a mental disorder? Who gets to decide what counts as proper brain functioning? And of course, as you and I know, that's not something that you can read off a fMRI. If I do an fMRI of your brain and I do one of my brain and I say, well, wait, your brain, this particular area is lighting up and it's not lighting up in my brain. Does that mean that my brain's dysfunctional and yours is functional? Does it mean yours is dysfunctional, mine is dysfunctional? Does it just mean our brains are functioning a little bit differently? And it seemed like these very basic kinds of questions weren't being asked. So ultimately, I kind of set aside philosophy of psychiatry and, okay, what are mental disorders? And just got fascinated with this question of what are functions? What is functioning? What's functional? What's dysfunctional? How do you decide? And for my own purposes, it was way easier to say, okay, forget about psychiatry and mental illness. That is way too controversial. Is ADHD, is that normal functioning or is that a dysfunction? Set that aside. That just makes people angry. Think about, the function of the heart is to pump blood. The function of the zebra stripes is to camouflage or whatever the function is supposed to be. And I discovered that there's a whole group of philosophers, mainly philosophers of biology, who were also really fascinated with this question of biological function and dysfunction. So I ended up actually spending a good part of my philosophical career just thinking about functions at this very basic level. And then what I found was that this concept of biological function tied into a lot of other debates in philosophy. So it ended up being like this cornerstone for a lot of my thinking because it ties into debates about the nature of mind and mental representation. What is it for some bit of brain activity to represent a tree or a desk or a house or some, a bear or some feature of the external world? Well, presumably because there's some part of the brain that has the biological function of tracking that part of the world, and misrepresentation has something to do with malfunction. So the concept of function tied into questions about psychiatry and biomedicine and representation, even the nature of aging. Is aging a dysfunction or is that normal function? The notion of biological function seemed to ramify in all these different directions. So it's only in the last few years that I've finally gotten back to my first love, which was psychiatry and what counts as mental health and what counts as mental disorder. Hopefully I have a somewhat better answer to those questions now than I did, 20 years ago.
Yeah. So when you first got to that question, was there a big difference between how people were thinking about mental functions and non-mental functions?
Well, in the 1970s, when people started, philosophers started getting really interested in, okay, what are biological functions? What does it mean to say that the function of the heart is to pump blood? They took it for granted that functions in the biological world and then functions in the mental world were going to be one and the same kind of thing. So an example would be, uh, the function of the heart. The idea was that a statement like the function of the heart is to pump blood, and a statement like the function of the second hand on your watch is to mark seconds, you were supposed to be able to give one and the same analysis for both kinds of functions. And in the 70s, that was like a basic criterion of adequacy for a good theory of biological function. Whatever your theory of biological function is, also has to work for artifact functions, also has to work for the kinds of things that human beings make and create. And that, I think, turned out to be a real stumbling block for a lot of these theorists because they're trying to come up with these analyses that it's really hard to put in one definition of function that makes sense of the way in which the heart has the function of pumping blood and also makes sense of the way in which, the second hand on my watch has the function of marking seconds. So I think what happened in the 1980s, you had people like Ruth Millikan and Karen Neander who just said, this isn't going to work. The concept of function that's going to make sense of what's going on in the biological world probably is not going to neatly make sense of the concept of function in the world of human design, which in retrospect, it seems obvious. Like, of course, I mean, when it comes to the human world, you can give a function to anything at any time. I can take a book and give it the function of being a doorstop, and functions arise very easily and naturally in the human world just from a rather arbitrary choice that we make. But it seems like in nature, when we say the function of the heart is to pump blood or the function of the liver is to detoxify the blood, we're talking about a selection process that potentially took thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to create. They don't arbitrarily come into existence in that way.
Right. So the evolutionary aspect became very important.
Yeah, and the main point of view of function that I gravitated toward was this selected effects theory of function, which effectively just says simply put, that the function of a biological trait is whatever is designed for by natural selection. I know some people don't like the metaphor of design, but I, I'm just going to help myself to it for present purposes. The function of a trait is whatever it's designed for. So the function of the heart is to pump blood because that's what it was selected for by natural selection. And there are so many strengths of that view, and I have a whole book just, describing why this is such a compelling picture of function. Among other reasons, is that it makes functions truly mind-independent, objective features of the world, which is what, when you go back to psychiatry, and they insist that in order for something to be a mental disorder, it has to be based on some kind of objective dysfunction inside of you. They're really insisting that the notion of function and dysfunction, there's an objective mind independent fact of how your brain is supposed to function and how it's not supposed to function, that this is not an arbitrary social construct. It's very important for the discourse, for the way that they think about it, that functions are objective, mind-independent facts of reality. And that's one big plus of the selected effects theory. If you say, okay, the function of a trait is just whatever it was designed to do by natural selection, functions become objective, mind-independent features of reality. And that's also really crucial for thinking about the nature of mental representation. So suppose I want to explain what it is for part of your brain to represent some feature of the external world. And I say, well, it depends on the biological functions of that particular part of the brain. It's important that whatever notion of function I'm appealing to, these functions exist in some kind of mind-independent way. Otherwise, you just have this circular argument. And at least some of the main theories of function, like what's called the causal role theory of function, the idea is that the function of a trait is just its contribution to some system level capacity that we happen to be interested in. So it invokes kind of the interests and the perspectives of the researchers who are attributing functions. Part of what it is to have a function is to be the object of interest of some kind of a research team. And so a lot of the kind of mainstream views of function make function very heavily mind dependent. So that's one reason I kind of gravitated toward this selected effects theory. But I guess I'll just say this. The other reason, and this is something that a lot of philosophers who think about biological function don't really take seriously, or seriously enough, I think. Often when we attribute a function to something, we're really talking about its purpose. If I say the function of the heart is to pump blood, or the function of the liver is to detoxify the blood, or the function of zebra stripes is to ward off biting flies, I'm talking about what it's for. I'm talking about its purpose. You could just as easily swap out the term function with the term purpose, say the purpose of the heart. Or you could just as easily say the function of a trait or the purpose of a trait is the same thing as what it was made for, what it was designed for. So whether we like it or not, when we start thinking deeply about the notion of function, we also have to think deeply about the notion of purpose in nature. Do parts of the natural world have purposes independent of human values, human cognition? And then this takes us back to the whole story of science in the modern world. In the scientific revolution, people like Francis Bacon or, Galileo or Isaac Newton said, it's illegitimate to talk about purposes in nature. You can only talk about efficient causes. You can't talk about, the purpose of the solar system or the purpose of the sun. You could just talk about the efficient causes that explain why they exist. But then you look at biology, and okay, throughout biology, we do talk about the function of a trait, the purpose of a trait. We attribute goals to creatures. We say, what is the goal of the bacterium, moving up a food gradient? So biology is replete with talk of function, purpose, design, goals. And so it seemed to me that the selected effects theory of function not only uh, kind of made functions objective, mind independent features of reality, kind of like causes, um, but it also kind of made sense of the notion of purpose in nature. It helped to make sense of this idea that when I attribute a function to a trait, uh, in a sense, I'm trying to explain why that trait exists. When I say that the function of the zebra stripes is to deter biting flies, I'm trying to explain to you why zebras have stripes. And I think the selected effects theory makes sense of this explanatory role of functions in the way that the other theories of function really don't try to.
Right. And so that's the main criteria for that theory, that it's objective, mind independent explanations of functions rather than operational ones or causal ones.
Yeah, but not just that. That is a part of it, absolutely, and that functions have the same status as causation. They're parts of reality, and it seems to me that that's how biologists talk and think about them, is as if these are parts of reality, just as causation is. Um, but also that the selected effects theory makes sense of this explanatory, that feature of functions, that when I attribute a function to a trait, I'm trying to explain why that trait exists. When I say the function of the eye is to see, I'm trying to explain why people have eyes. People have eyes because eyes are good at seeing. Um, and it seems to me that the only way that functions could possibly be explanatory in that way is if functions are selected effects. If when we're stating the function of a trait, we're really just stating why natural selection brought it into being. We're actually, when we state the function of a trait, we're actually giving a kind of roundabout explanation for why the trait exists. So it's that explanatory feature of functions that the selected effects theory does such a good job preserving.
Right. Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. So this idea of purpose was totally plunged from science for a while, and teleology was seen as suspect. But I feel like more and more people are getting interested in it now. Do you think it's making a comeback of sorts?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm not sure what exactly accounts for it. Even 50 years ago, uh, people weren't sure, like this, when it comes to the selected effect theory of function. People were saying, some people were saying, okay, finally we can eliminate talk of function and purpose from the natural world. There's all this talk of function and purpose. We're really just talking about selected effects. But other people like me and other, the philosophers who were really writing about this in the 80s and 90s were saying, no, this actually, it vindicates talk of function and purpose. We're not trying to delete or eliminate talk of function and purpose. We're not trying to finally complete this project that was started in the scientific revolution to get rid of talk and of function and purpose. We're trying to validate it, to provide a naturalistic foundation for it so that it'll be safe to talk about, so that if a biologist doesn't feel embarrassed when they say, what's the purpose of the zebra stripes, or when they talk about the goal directedness of a bacterium moving up a food gradient, they don't have to feel embarrassed. They don't have to say, well, I mean function or purpose, but I just mean it metaphorically. No, they can mean these terms uh, uh, literally. And I think that that people are starting to appreciate that, biology never successfully got rid of the language: purpose, function, goals, ends, final causes. And we don't even know how to do biology without talking about functions and goals. So you couldn't even explain, if you wanted to explain, why it is that the, gosling follows around its mother, without talking about invoking language of purpose and goals. Well, it has the goal of following around its mother. You wouldn't even know how to talk about it. So I guess what's happening now isn't so much that we're reintroducing purpose biology, but we're embracing it rather than feeling embarrassed about it. Like it's some kind of dirty little secret that we can't really get rid of talk of function and purpose.
No, I mean, which makes sense. We should just go where our best explanations lead us rather than hold on to the dogmas of the past.
hmm Yeah, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier before the interview. I mean, in a sense, what's the job of philosophy of science or philosophy of biology or philosophy of physics? Is it to dictate to scientists, here's how you need to think? You're not allowed to talk about, function or purpose or design in the natural world. Or is it to look at what scientists are actually doing, look at how biology actually functions and what seems to make it so successful as a branch of science, and then come along and try to provide some kind of conceptual foundations to say, like, here are some, if you're going to talk about function, purpose, and design, here's one way you could do that. And your talk of function, purpose, and design is going to be perfectly consistent with all of these other kind of broad metaphysical commitments that you have as scientists. And I think that's much more true in psychiatry, where there are still such very basic mysteries, like how do we decide, what's normal, what's abnormal, and what's order, and what's disorder when it comes to the mind. There's a very deep need, I think, for philosophers to come along and help provide some of those conceptual foundations.
That's one of the great things about philosophy of science, right? That it has this very, very aggressive focus on conceptual understanding, but still tries to take a robust vision of what is happening in the actual science that's relevant to those conceptual questions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what I find is that generally scientists really appreciate philosophers, and philosophy. Not all the time. Sometimes, I think philosophers kind of get out of line and we start like dictating, here's how you need to think about the nature of reality. But in my experience, talking with biologists or with psychiatrists, they genuinely love thinking about and talking about these kind of conceptual foundations of their field, and they appreciate that. Oh, finally, there's somebody who I can talk to, not about, okay, is the function of the zebra stripes camouflage or deterring biting flies? I can talk to my colleagues in biology all day about that, but finally, here's somebody that I can talk to about, what are biological functions and what are purposes in nature? Yeah, who really does get to say what's normal and abnormal when it comes to the mind? I feel like so many of the scientists I meet are like frustrated philosophers. They have all these kind of deep philosophical problems and concerns, and they often just don't get a chance to engage with other people in a deep way about them. So that's been very fun as being a philosopher of science, is engaging with scientists on this level.
I mean, it might just be like a fault of how the academy is structured these days, but science just incentivizes focusing on operational definitions and getting really good at a method and stuff. But all philosophy is saying is, what does the science actually point to about something in the world? So it's very natural for scientists to be very enthusiastic about those questions.
Yeah, and scientists go into science because they're thinking about these deep questions about the nature of reality, and then their careers kind of demand that they focus in and hone in and specialize on one small kind of problem. And yeah, I think all of us wanted, with philosophers and scientists, we got into this because we wanted to think big about the nature of reality. What is science telling us about the nature of reality? For sure.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Shifting gears a bit. Okay, so now we have this view of functions and purposes. So instead of applying it to biological functions, what about group level functions? Uh, do those play in?
Well, it's a really big question. And that too touches on a deep bias in the history of biology. So I think really starting in the 1970s, there's this idea that when I try to explain the function of part of the mind, say the function of attention or the function of awareness or the function of the zebra stripes, whatever it is, I have to point to some benefit that that trait confers on that particular individual. So when I say that the function of the zebra stripes is to deter biting flies, I'm pointing to some benefit that it confers on that particular zebra. It helps that zebra survive, or it helps that zebra to reproduce. But then, of course, there are aspects of the biological world where a trait has the function for a group, not for the particular individual. So, the bee's stinger is a wonderful example of something that obviously it doesn't have a function for the bee, because when the bee stings somebody, it usually kills the bee. The stinger is just ripped out of its body, and its innards just get mutilated. So to the extent that it has a function, we need to talk about the function of the stinger for the hive or for the group. And similarly, when we talk about, say, altruism in human beings or in other animals, you have these species that are very altruistic, naked mole rats, kind of like honeybees. They will happily die for the sake of the colony as a whole, and you really can't, it's hard to understand that aggressive behavior in terms of a benefit for that particular individual, either in terms of its survival or its reproduction. You're really thinking about a benefit for the group as a whole. And I think in the kind of when evolutionary psychology was getting off the ground in it goes back some time, sociobiology of the 1970s, and then evolutionary psychology of the 1980s, when you start looking at the functions of the human mind in terms of how do our cognitive processes help us to survive and reproduce, there was this very kind of individualistic bias where, in order to think about the function of human cognition or human behavior, there's this kind of prejudice that you had to think about it in terms of how do these functions benefit me as an individual. But of course, there are certain kinds of behavior that it's really hard to give to explain why somebody acts the way they do in terms of some kind of benefit that they receive for their behavior. So, again, instances of just altruism, instances of people giving away large sums of money anonymously, where they're not even getting the benefit of social recognition for their actions. And people do things like this all the time, not necessarily on such a large scale, but on small scales. People often help others in ways that they never get any particular credit for. And it's hard to explain why this altruistic tendency in people, unless you assume that, kind of like honeybees, human altruism isn't always designed to help the individual survive and reproduce. It's meant to help the group as a whole. And I think one benefit of the selected effects theory is that it's not, or any account of function that's worth thinking deeply about, is that it doesn't contain this kind of, it doesn't presuppose this individual level bias when we're thinking about functions. The selected effects theory lets us talk about, the function of the heart is to pump blood because that's how it helps me survive. The function of the honeybee stingers to support the hive because that's how it helps the hive survive. There's no assumption that functions have to benefit the individual in some way.
Right. And again, I think fortunately, psychology and cognitive science are kind of moving in that direction, where more and more recognizing the identity and the agency of groups as something not ontologically different from, but something operationally different from the collection of individuals.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, when you think about the human body as just a large, vast uh, collection of cells that manage to cooperate very well and manage to behave altruistically toward one another. Um, at least it should be intellectually coherent that a group of people could exhibit altruism toward one another as well.
Right? No, that's a good point. If we're very ardently reductionistic, then we're going to be reductionistic about everything. Everything is somewhat composed of some components. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So sorry for that detour, but returning to psychiatry. So now applying this refined definition of purposes, of functions, and the backdrop of purposes back to psychiatry. So what changed then in how mental dysfunctions were classified?
Well, what happened for me is that one of the things that I started discovering is that often enough in cases of what we call mental illness, um, there's nothing objectively malfunctioning inside of you, in your mind or in your brain. Um, and so that was I think for me, a kind of unexpected benefit of thinking carefully about biological function. So I have these psychiatrists here who are saying, okay, when somebody has a mental disorder, by definition, what that means is that something inside of them in their mind or in their brain isn't working the way that it's supposed to work. And that was giving rise to, say, this chemical imbalance language. So in the case of depression, there must be some kind of a chemical imbalance. Maybe your serotonin receptors aren't working the way that they're designed to work. And what I started discovering is that there's a whole group of theorists who think that actually, in a lot of these cases of mental illness, everything inside of you is working uh, exactly the way that it's designed to. So yes, that's what I was trying to get at. One unexpected benefit of thinking seriously about functions is that it was starting to lead to this very different kind of paradigm of psychiatry where, say, the depression is a really great example of something where, since the Prozac revolution in the 1980s, even before that, there's this idea that, well, depression comes from a chemical imbalance, probably having to do with too little uh, uh, serotonin. Uh, and as a consequence, you know, the relationship between serotonin and depression is kind of like the relationship between diabetes and insulin. And so this chemical imbalance picture helped to confirm this idea that psychiatry really was just a branch of medicine and that mental disorders really were diseases like any other. And then I started encountering the work of some of a group of people known as the evolutionary psychiatrists, people like Randolph Ness and Vivek Glover and others who are saying, no, actually, depression has an evolved purpose. It has an evolved function. If somebody gets deeply depressed, at least in some circumstances, nothing at all is going wrong in their brains. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. There are forms of dementia, Lewy body dementia, where literally your neurons are dying off, and depression might be one symptom of that. Well, in that case, we do have good evidence that depression does come from some kind of a neurological dysfunction. But in the ordinary case of somebody who gets depressed, say relationship isn't working out or career plans aren't working out, they might sink into a deep depression. One of the theories is that their depression has an evolved purpose. It's not a dysfunction. And then, of course, you might ask, well, what exactly would be the evolved purpose of depression? And one purpose, or at least one kind of main theory, is that your depression is something like your brain's wake-up call. It's like your brain trying to tell you that there's something going wrong in your life. There's something some area of your life that needs more attention. Um, so suppose suppose I'm pursuing a career plan and I'm just hitting one obstacle after the next. Depression might be the brain's evolved signal to say, okay, Justin, let's just withdraw from this particular plan and reevaluate our life goals. And that can be extremely hard. That can be extremely hard to do. We can be extremely invested in, say, pursuing a career plan that's just not right for us, that just doesn't match our talents and capacities. And sometimes depression comes in to say, okay, we need to back away from this particular plan. But if that's right, if depression, say, can be your mind's evolved signal that something in your life isn't working out, then psychiatry, with this chemical imbalance metaphor, is really failing a lot of people, because it would actually be giving the exact wrong advice to people. It would be saying, here, take these, you have some kind of chemical imbalance, take these medications or go to therapy, take the medications, and somehow with a combination of a therapy and medications, we're going to make your depression go away and you can get back to whatever it is that you were doing before. Sometimes the right answer is no, your brain is trying to tell you to stop that particular course of action. Medications, I think, have a role. I have nothing against medications. But you think about how that's exactly not necessarily what you want to do when somebody's seriously depressed. The same goes for some of the anxiety disorders. I mean, sometimes having a very high level of anxiety is a perfectly functional, perfectly coherent response to serious life challenges. Again, that doesn't mean you should never medicate it, but it does mean that you should maybe listen to what it's trying to tell you and perhaps assume that your brain is functioning pretty well and that there is some good reason that you're feeling this way. And that listening to that might have some kind of benefits for you. So thinking seriously about function started leading me toward this very different perspective on psychiatry and what we call these mental health disorders, where I started to imagine that at least sometimes there's actually a function being performed. And this seemed to me to go against really this kind of deeply entrenched biomedical wisdom, since the 1970s, when we've looked for chemical imbalances underlying, depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or what have you. And certainly in my own experience and my dad's experience in the 1970s and in the 1980s and the 1990s, it was always a question of get back on your pills. The reason you're having these problems, or your reason, my dad's having psychotic episodes, or, you Justin, are having depression, you need to get on these pills because there's a chemical imbalance. And you should feel better about yourself, because of the fact that it's just a chemical imbalance. You didn't do anything wrong. Your dad didn't do anything wrong. It's just the way that your brains are wired. Your brains are just miswired a little bit, and we can help you. And so I started to see that that whole way of thinking, the kinds of metaphors that we use, the kinds of practices that stem from those metaphors could ultimately be hurting people sometimes far more than they're helping people.
Part of the problem, I feel like, is how tricky diagnosis is, right? Not just given the fact that it's so easy to self-diagnose, but also the fact that professional psychologists struggle with it. That you can easily confuse dysfunctions that might be, perfectly functioning functions versus instances where there might be some actual damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the problem, is that there are a lot of cases where it's just perfectly unclear, whether is something performing a function here. If so, we kind of need to know about that. Or like in the case of, say, depression due to Lewy body dementia, Is it just that something in this person's brain flatly is not working the way that it's supposed to? We need to intervene medically, or is it maybe there's a little bit of both going on? But it seems to me that this is such a fundamental question, and I certainly my claim isn't that all mental illness is really functional rather than dysfunctional. But what it seems to me is that the default paradigm, at least since the 1970s, has been there is some kind of brain dysfunction underlying your depression or anxiety, psychotic episodes, or whatever, borderline personality disorder, autism, ADHD, whatever it is, something's going wrong in your brain. It seemed to me that that was the default assumption, and that this basic question of purpose or function wasn't even coming up. So my goal certainly isn't to say, hey, everything's really functional rather than dysfunctional, but rather like, how do we get the notion of function and purpose back into the conversation, back into the mix when we're thinking about psychiatry and mental illness?
So imagine then this idea of mental disorders being perfectly working functions is pretty liberatory for people who have been told their entire lives that their disorder is something bad or something wrong with them.
It's a really interesting topic because I've been writing, doing this blog for Psychology Today for the last year or so. In each post, I choose one example of a research project that I think illustrates this idea of some mental illness as being functional or purposeful. So I've done one on depression. This idea of depression as your brain's wake up call. Some of the traits of BPD, some of the borderline personality disorder, as really survival strategies that some people have learned in response to real traumatic events, or even dyslexia. We often think of it as your brain kind of disorder of reading and writing, and there's some emerging evidence that it's actually a distinct, evolved cognitive style. That when we look at what we call dyslexia is actually a certain evolved style of cognition. And one side effect of that is difficulty reading and writing, but that's not, that's not what the thing itself is. And two things I want to say about that. One is that almost every time I write one of these posts, I get emails from people who are so grateful. I never get emails from angry psychiatrists saying, how dare you, suggest to my poor patients that their brains are functioning fine. They're going to get off their meds and you should be ashamed of yourself. People don't say that. Rather, I get emails from people who've been diagnosed with serious mental disorders saying, thank you so much for your post. I've never come across this viewpoint. I've been diagnosed with BPD for the last 30 years. Nobody's ever told me this idea. I've been diagnosed with depression for 20 years. Nobody's ever suggested this idea that my brain is actually functioning the way it should, given the kinds of circumstances, or with dyslexia, that I have an evolved cognitive style. It's not, learning disability, or not just a learning disability, but the disabling aspects of it are aspects of this broader function or purpose. I mean, those are the kinds of emails that I get. And the second thing connected with this, I've been talking with some psychiatrists and psychologists who study the problem of stigma. And, since the 1980s, the received wisdom was, and this is, I got this message and my dad got this message, the received wisdom was, once you understand that your depression is, it's just some kind of chemical misfiring in your brain, you'll feel better about yourself because you won't blame yourself for it. You won't think that it's because you're a bad person. I never thought that I was a bad person, for feeling depressed. I don't think my dad ever thought that he was like a bad person for having psychotic episodes. But there's been this ton of research done that this chemical imbalance language can actually be more stigmatizing for people with schizophrenia, for people with depression, partly because it suggests that your problems stem from an irreversible brain defect. And it sometimes suggests to other people, hey, you might be unpredictable and you might be dangerous because, you have this brain defect and who knows what you're going to do next. So it actually, chemical imbalance metaphors tend to encourage other people to want to put distance between themselves and the person who's been diagnosed. So a friend of mine who's a professor of psychiatry, Hans Schroeder, he's been doing this really fascinating research recently, not just studying the negative stigmatizing impact of this disease language, but also looking specifically, and as far as I know, he's the only person doing this, looking at how framing depression as functional, what impact is that having on stigma? What impact is that having on the way that people actually think about themselves? And so what he did is he about a year ago, he got together about 800 people who had some experience with depression, and he divided them into two groups. And group A got this short lecture that framed their depression as a chemical imbalance. Group B got pretty much the same lecture, but it framed depression along these evolutionary lines. It's effectively your brain's wake-up call that something in your life isn't going well and needs more attention. And what they found is that the people who got this depression as an evolved signal framing actually tended to do better. They'd score higher on these various measures of well-being. They felt less stigma. They felt more agency, more control over their depression, and they even felt like their depression might have some useful insights for them. And so that's an area of research that I'm just now starting to explore in much more detail, not just the kinds of questions that, as philosophers of science, we tend to ask. Okay, do mental disorders always involve dysfunction? Do they sometimes involve function? What are some of the research and therapeutic implications? Now step back and look sociologically, what are some of the impacts of framing and messaging when it comes to mental disorders? And that's something that I, it, I mean, the whole thinking of mental illness in terms of function rather than dysfunction is urgent, both from the point of view of research and for the point of view of treatment. It's important for the point of view of thinking, okay, should I be on medications or not in this particular situation? But it's equally urgent for just the way that people experience their own mental illness and for the way that other people relate, and is a huge implications for every aspect of psychiatry.
Yeah, no, I mean, the agency point seems like a really big point to me. And it does feel so demoralizing to when people are told that this is just not in your control. This is something fixed about you, and even more than that, your actions are not in your control. They're also random, and we'll put the explanations elsewhere, and we won't give you any responsibility for them. Yeah, it just feels like an idea that it's very demoralizing. It makes you feel like a child.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have had exactly that experience with psychiatry, where they just feel as soon as they get diagnosed, again, this has been true of me and a lot of people I know, as soon as they get diagnosed, the messaging is effectively, you can't trust your own emotions. You can't trust your own thoughts. You just need to do what we say. You can't trust yourself. You can't trust the way that you think, the way that you feel. You got to kind of do what we say, and we can help you manage the disorder that you have. I mean, there are some people for whom that's the message that they need to have. When people are, say, consumed by hallucinations or hearing voices telling them to kill themselves, or seeing, demons taunting them. I mean, some people really do that message that, hey, your brain is not working the way that it's supposed to. Don't listen to this stuff. You don't need to ponder whether any of this is real. We do have medications that are going to help you get back on track. There are some kind of urgent situations where that disease dysfunction language can be beneficial to people. So I don't want to say that it's never useful. And even sometimes, people who are anxious, like I am. I'm a very anxious person. I've been on medications for that at various points in my life. And sometimes it is really helpful to be like, you know what? Your brain is just spitting out chemicals in this weird way. You really don't have to pay attention to this anxiety. So there is a place for the kind of disease dysfunction language, but in large part, the experience that I've had and the experience of so many people that I've talked to had, it's so demoralizing to just be told, you can't trust your thoughts, you can't trust your feelings. Give us your complete obedience at this point, and you will be okay.
So I know you've been following the Mad Pride movement. What's going on there? How are people responding to this?
The Mad Pride movement, really one basic goal is to reappropriate the very idea of being mad, or the very idea of madness. And that's why I use the term madness so often in what I write, is because I don't think of it as this, pejorative, antiquated term, oh, this person is mad. As I see it, the Mad Pride movement is really reappropriating the label and the concept of madness and trying to, which I fully endorse, trying to rethink madness outside of medical context altogether. And this is something really interesting because historically, when you look at the history of madness and the history of psychiatry, it wasn't always obvious to people that madness is a medical problem, that madness falls under the jurisdiction of medicine. So, 500 years ago, if somebody was seeing things, hearing things, feeling terrified all the time, they were just as likely to be sent to an exorcist as to a doctor. And I'm not saying that was good. I'm not saying let's go back to the good old days when people would go to an exorcist rather than the doctor. But I'm using examples like that to show that it wasn't obvious that what we're calling madness falls under the authority of medicine. And that today seems to be a concept that I'd like to challenge, the idea that, or not necessarily to challenge, but even to understand, when did we come to kind of accept as this basic dogma that madness is a medical issue, that it falls under the jurisdiction of doctors, that it falls under the authority of medicine. People haven't always thought that way. Even in the 1960s, a lot of people said, look, if you're depressed or you're having psychotic episodes, or you've been labeled with some kind of a personality disorder, that's probably a perfectly coherent response to your life experiences. It's not a medical issue. So even in the 1960s, when people would look at madness as an intelligible or a coherent or a purposeful response to their life issues, that was one way of questioning the authority of medicine. So as I see it, it's kind of like this. When you put the idea of madness together with the idea of medicine, you get mental illness, you get mental disorder. So mental disorder happens when madness meets medicine. So as I see it, Mad Pride is really, it's an attempt to do a lot of different things, but I think one thing is to start reconceptualizing madness outside of this confining medical sphere. I'm not saying that medicine never has a role for treating madness, but simply the project of trying to think about it in this more positive way, not necessarily positive in the sense that madness is good, but positive in the sense of we're not just thinking about madness as dysfunction or as disease or as lack of proper functioning. We're thinking about it as something with a kind of positive essence in its own right, not just a kind of lack or a failure of function.
Do you think that how we think of medicine and how we just conceptualize the boundaries of what treatment looks like, do you think that's going to expand to consider these broader social factors? I don't mean to use social callously. I think sometimes people just mean too much by that. Or do you think it's just going to be two different domains of what people will have to go to deal with? I know that's
That's it.
speculative.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. So as I see it, you're asking, okay, is psychiatry going to expand its paradigms to seriously take into account, say, social, cultural precursors? It's a really hard question to answer for a couple of reasons. And it's something that I've actively been thinking about and working on this very issue. So here's two different viewpoints you might have. One viewpoint, when I talk to psychiatrists sometimes, and I say, it seems to me that psychiatry has been, since the 1970s, has been really locked in this kind of dysfunction-centered model, and they've neglected seeing mental illness in terms of function and purpose and adaptation. A lot of psychiatrists say, no, not at all. We're not locked into some limiting dysfunction-centered model. We recognize that some aspects of mental illness can be functional and purposeful and adaptive. And that's perfectly consistent with modern psychiatry to see both function and dysfunction. And psychiatry is going to simply grow and expand to accommodate these newer understandings. So that's one kind of optimistic point of view, that psychiatry is expanding its viewpoint on the nature of mental illness, sometimes seeing function, sometimes seeing dysfunction. But I've also had this more, I guess, suspicious or pessimistic point of view, and I'll try to convey it. The idea, my suspicion is something like this. What makes psychiatry a medical specialty? Why do mental disorders fall under the jurisdiction of medicine? Why would they fall under the jurisdiction of medicine at all? Well, presumably because mental disorders are medical problems. So, by definition, it seems to me that psychiatry must see mental disorders as medical problems. If it didn't see mental disorders as medical problems, then what would it have to do with mental disorders? It wouldn't have any real authority or jurisdiction over them. So now, if psychiatry as a branch of medicine is metaphysically committed to seeing mental disorders as medical problems, what exactly does that mean? What exactly does that commit them to? And I guess my worry is that if it's true that by definition psychiatry must see mental disorders as medical problems, and if it's also true, something that seems very plausible, that to see something as a medical problem is to see it in terms of a failure of function, to see it in terms of something inside of you not working the way that it's supposed to, well, then that leads to a kind of disturbing conclusion that psychiatry, as such, as a branch of medicine, is deeply committed to a dysfunction-centered model of mental illness. I hope that makes sense. That's what I've been thinking about a lot over the last couple of months. I want to believe my psychiatry friends when they say, psychiatry is always expanding and changing paradigms, and we're happy to look at something from a function point of view as much of a dysfunction point of view. But I do worry that there is something essential to the very definition of psychiatry, which, as a branch of medicine, these are medical problems. And it seems to me that by definition, for something to be a medical problem means that something inside of you isn't working the way that it's supposed to. So I do worry that psychiatry as such is deeply wedded to a dysfunction-centered model. But then that raises the equally kind of disturbing implication that if so, then when I argue that we ought to adopt a kind of functional framing of mental disorder rather than a dysfunctional framing, I'm not encouraging psychiatry to expand its conceptual boundaries. I'm really rejecting psychiatry as such. I'm encouraging us to go beyond psychiatry. Those are the kinds of problems that I've been thinking about a lot recently.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, of course, there's a disparity in psychiatry between the the well-established methods, the considered sort of theory, and how people actually apply them. Right, even the best therapist in the world, the best psychologist in the world, can't apply a theory to the letter. So there's a lot of variability there. But there's no way of moving the discipline forward without changing the methods. And if the methods to their core are the way that you describe them, or the theory to the core is the way that you describe them, then there is a pretty firm limitation.
I think so. I think the basic question, and it's one that I feel like I'm almost alone in thinking about right now. Maybe there are other people thinking about it. But I guess the basic question for me now really has to do with the basis of psychiatry's authority. What gives psychiatry authority to treat mental disorders? And is the very idea that psychiatry has authority to treat mental disorders, does that in and of itself come with some very limiting assumptions? And if so, then just saying the same thing I already said, but if that's right, then seeing mental disorders as functional rather than dysfunctional would really be a way of challenging psychiatry's authority. That's where I imagine things might be going. I'm not sure.
Right. So then, do you imagine there would be other sort of institutions, practices, communities on top that would do that job? So, people talk about like contemplative traditions, spirituality. These are places that people go to, go aside from psychiatry.
Yeah, I think that there would be, and it's hard to even talk about, what a post-psychiatry world would look like. But I think that there would be certainly a lot more emphasis on peer support networks, which you're already seeing now. I just think that that would be ramped up tremendously, where it's other people who have been diagnosed with the same kind of problems working together to navigate those problems. And you're already seeing that. So you have movements like the Hearing Voices Network, which is made up of patients, ex-patients, service users working together to think about the best way of navigating what can be an extremely distressing kind of experience, and really coming up with actually useful and tested methods. Here are some ways of navigating voices that are hostile to you. Here are some ways of dealing with a situation when you have a voice that's telling you to kill yourself. Here are some tried and tested methods by people who have experience with these very phenomenon. So I see, again, I hate thinking in terms of a post-psychiatry world, but if we ever did enter a post-psychiatry world, I think that would be a much bigger part of it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is to make sure people don't take these things dogmatically, right? That both or all or one or some of these things can be true. It doesn't have to be exclusive.
I agree with what you said. That's the issue, is that people have very different kinds of needs. I guess it's not really a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. As we talked about earlier, sometimes it's really valuable for people to be told that, hey, my depression is not, there's nothing wrong with my brain. My brain is working exactly the way that it's supposed to. For other people, they really benefit by being told, look, there's just some kind of a something in your brain is not working the way that it's supposed to. So you don't have to listen to these voices, or you don't have to take these feelings at face value. So different people have different kinds of needs, for sure.